Good evening, everybody. My name is Larry Solon. If you don't know me, it's Larry Solon even if you do know me. And I am a professor here, and I'm also the director of the Center for the Study of Law, Language, and Cognition. In the last few years, we've been having a number of programs structured as this one is, as a talk and conversation about issues that are relevant to law, language, psychology, and legal ethics. And we really couldn't be more fortunate than to have Adam Colbert here tonight. Adam is one of my colleagues on the faculty. He joined the Brooklyn Law School faculty in 2010, and having taught before that in San Diego, he clerked for Judge Straub of the Second Circuit, and had earlier practiced at Davis Polk. He is a graduate of Stanford Law School, and since graduating from law school and becoming an academic, he's done one distinguished thing after another. He started the Neuroscience and Law blog, and he's become one of the leading experts in the relationship between brain science and the law. And it's very controversial issues as to how much we know about how, as we learn more about the brain, it should affect our attitudes towards how criminal justice should be dispensed. I'm sure that everybody here has had at least some casual contact with the conversation about, oh, this is a dangerous person because there was some kind of brain scan or something like that. One of the leaders in investigating and developing the relationship between the ethical issues facing the criminal justice system and what we know about the human brain as we develop our knowledge, which is developing and growing rapidly, is Adam Colbert. He's really a star in this area. He's published a great deal. There's a book that came out recently where we both have articles in it, and I'm very proud to be in that with him. So without any further ado, let me turn the floor over to Adam Colbert, who will talk about free will as a matter of criminal law. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, Larry. It's great to see some familiar faces and some new faces. So let me start out by talking to you about a parasite. There's some evidence that many people around the world have been infected by a parasite caused by certain cats, and it causes toxoplasmosis. There's a Czech scientist who's leading this research. He thinks that these parasites remain dormant in our brains long after we experience an acute infection, and he thinks that they subtly affect brain function for years to come. Now, perhaps these parasites don't make us insane or irrational. Maybe it just changes personalities a little bit, makes people perhaps more careless, more impulsive, maybe more tempted by criminal behavior. Now, I don't want to put a lot of stock in this research. We don't know if it's really going to be proven. There was a recent scientific paper that raised some doubts about the science. But for the sake of argument, let's suppose it's true. Let's suppose that through no fault of his own, some guy gets infected by a parasite, and it does alter his brain function. It makes him more careless, more impulsive, more prone to criminal behavior, nothing that qualifies as a traditional mental illness. But he commits a crime, and let's stipulate this important bit. He would not have committed this crime had he not been infected by the parasite. Okay? So I want you to think a little bit about a situation like this, and I'll just do a kind of gut, off-the-cuff poll of your intuitions about this. You're going to have two choices. So pick the one that's closest to what you think. The first choice is the infection that led to his behavior should not be a major factor at either his conviction or at his sentencing. That's choice one, not a major factor at conviction or sentencing. Second choice, the fact of this parasite should be a major factor at either conviction or at sentencing. Got it? I'm going to raise my hand both times. Okay, so again, first choice, let's raise your hand if you think should not be a major factor at either conviction or sentencing. 4 or 5 hands. Okay, how about should be a major factor at conviction? Okay, so the vast majority of people in this room think that by knowing this bit about his brain, this bit about what caused his brain to function the way that it did, it has a dramatic effect on how culpable most of the room seems to think that he is, and I would say that reaction is very consistent with what I see in different environments when I ask the question. What may explain this is something that I call the reduced responsibility reaction. The more that we know about the causes of people's behavior in mechanistic terms, meaning like in scientific terms, in terms of physical causes, chemistry, physics, all that sort of thing, in terms of synapses of the brain, the less inclined we are to hold the person responsible. So for example, you might have this kind of reduced responsibility reaction when you find out that there's some growing evidence that preschool lead exposure, especially from car exhaust, may explain a lot of soaring crime rates from the 1960s through the 1980s. Notice that this lead exposure might have made a person prone to criminal behavior without giving them any traditionally recognized legal excuse, without perhaps even giving them any traditionally recognized mental illness that would be likely to get them a discounted sentencing. So this leads to a little bit of background on this big question of free will. The reaction that many of you seem to have, namely understanding the physical causes of someone's behavior, making you less likely to ascribe blame to them, seems to speak to a deeper concern about all forms of moral and legal responsibility. So when you think back to your physics class or something like that, the way they describe things are, here's a billiard ball, and that billiard ball crashes into another billiard ball, and it makes it go in this direction. At no point in your class did you talk about what the billiard ball decided to do or what it chose to do, right? When you understand it in physical terms, you don't expect some kind of explanation in terms of choice. Now, even if you took some advanced class and they talked about how radioactive atoms decay and maybe there is some indeterminism in there, well, we're just a collection of these things. We're a collection of billiard balls, a collection of decaying atoms, and whether it's entirely deterministic or a little bit indeterministic, we don't have control over the parts of our bodies at that level. But yet those parts of our bodies, those particles, those atoms, those molecules, those synapses entirely explain our behavior. So we're left with kind of a puzzle, how to make sense of how we can have responsibility in a world where we are these kinds of mechanistic creatures. I mean, surely we sometimes get mad at people even when they're just mechanisms. So a person next to you is snoring and you're mad at them for snoring, right? Even though you know they're not doing it. We sometimes have these reactions even when people are mechanisms. But it's hard to know if we can really make sense of that, hard to know if we can make sense of that at the level of a criminal justice system. So in this sort of part one of this talk, I'm going to note that while some scholars have prominently argued that the law is silent about free will, I'm going to argue that the matter isn't so clear. In fact, the law may have some deeply hidden views about free will that might just have some legal significance. And all those mights are really important, because I'm not going to say, yes, the law says this about free will with any certainty, but I'm going to raise some possibilities and talk about some arguments that might be viewed as plausible. So let's go back and say, we've got this problem of free will, right? It's lasted for millennia. Here are two kind of reasonable ways you might respond to them. One is free will denial, and this is a pretty radical reaction. On this view, the mechanistic nature of the world makes it such that we really lack free will. So this is the sort of reaction that relates to the reduced responsibility reaction that you had about toxoplasmosis, but it goes one further. It says, if knowledge about just part of the backstory of why this guy committed the crime who had this parasite, if knowledge of just a part of that reduces our tendency to ascribe blame, then the whole story would get rid of our inclination to punish at all, completely. It would just make it totally gone, and it would mean that moral responsibility doesn't make sense, and quite possibly legal responsibility wouldn't make so much sense either. That's one response. That's the free will denial, very radical. Here's another response that's not as radical. In fact, it's not radical at all. This is the compatibilist response. So the compatibilist says, hey, wait a second. All those of you who raised your hand about the parasite, you guys went too far. You shouldn't have raised your hand, because if knowledge of just the causal backstory makes you reduce responsibility, Well, then what happens when you hear the whole story? You're going to say that people don't have responsibility at all. And you can't say that. Why? Because responsibility is so important. It's something we all rely on. It's such a deeply seated notion in our psyche, in the society around us, et cetera, et cetera. So people who take the compatibilist picture, they don't deny what I said before about, we're all particles and things like that bouncing around. But what they say is something like, yup, even particles bouncing around can still be morally responsible so long as fill in the blanks. So long as they're still rational, or so long as they identify with the decisions that they make in some way, the compatibilists think we can still save responsibility. So all of that is philosophical, and philosophers, like I said, have tried to untangle these intuitions for a long time. But what about the law? What does the law say? Does the law care about free will? Traditional sources of law, like cases and statutes, say very little about free will directly, okay? Now, contrast that with sort of like justifications of punishment, like the ideas of retribution and deterring crime and incapacitating people and rehabilitating people. You can find that sometimes in the law, right? So when you're talking about sentencing, you'll see like federal, like 3553, right, will say, these are the kinds of justifications you're allowed to keep in mind when you're sentencing somebody. So we'll talk about these big justifications of punishment, but they don't talk about the question of free will. They don't say, is it ever possible for someone to freely will an action? Similarly, you will sometimes see the words free will in cases or statutes, but they're typically talking about something else. They're talking about, say, the duress defense. So you might wonder in the duress context, so the person had a gun to his back when he robbed the bank. Well, did he have enough voluntariness to that such that we should give him an excuse? That question is really different than the one that we're asking now. The question we're asking now is not whether we can ever so constrain someone's choices that we don't think it's fair to hold them responsible. We're asking an even more basic question now. That is it ever even possible for anyone to will anything such that they can be held responsible for it? So again, sometimes in the law you'll see mention of big justifications of punishment. Sometimes in the law you'll see discussions of free will when they really mean something about coerciveness or compulsion or something like that. But you're not very often going to see anything about this deep underlying metaphysical question about the law. All right, so what do you do when you're trying to interpret the law and you don't have a lot of sources that speak to it directly? You try to read the tea leaves as best you can. So one place you might turn is to think about the intent of the crafters of the law. And of course, what do we mean by the crafters of the criminal law? We mean things like, judges over centuries in different locations. We mean legislators crafting statutes in more recent decades or generations. So that's a pretty vague category. But what do we think that these judges and legislators typically thought about responsibility? I don't think they held either of the big views that I gave you. I don't think they were denying free will, and I don't think they were compatibilists in the sense that I don't think they bought into this story about physics and science and, so long as you're rational, you could be held responsible. Rather, I think they had a different view that I call soul-based libertarianism. So what do I mean by that? I mean by that, they had some view that we have souls, and those souls make decisions, and so long as your soul made a decision and you acted according to it, then we can hold you responsible, right? There's some idea of a person within you that's making free choices. It's kind of like the view that most of us grow up with in some respect, right? Even if you don't believe in soul in a kind of religious or spiritual way, it feels like we can make choices, and I think that's the view that is to a large extent embedded in the law, at least if you're looking at the kinds of intentions that people likely had over many centuries that sort of got infused in various ways. And in fact, if we were to survey legislators today, and we were to ask them, what do you think about responsibility and what do you think makes a person responsible? It wouldn't surprise me if we got answers that sounded a little bit like the soul-based view, so long as you've made some decision and it's part of who you are or something like that. I think that's the kind of response we might get. So because the criminal law was and perhaps continues to be crafted by soul-based libertarians, it was plausibly never intended to punish people who make decisions in the mechanistic manner that scientists now take to characterize human choice. It's possible that legislative and judicial silence about the matter was just meant to kind of delegate this question to judges, so maybe we can't read too much into intent. But I think that we don't have a lot to go on. Like I said, you're not going to find it in the text. So what do you do when you don't have a lot to go on? I think that the intent has a certain amount of weight to it. Now, why might this be important? Well, if this was a simple matter of people kind of coming together and deciding, we could just create the law to match whatever we think it should be. If we're free will denialists, we could just make the law match that. If we believe in some kind of compatibilist view, we can make the law match that. But the problem is there's really an impasse where people don't agree about all this stuff. So that makes the current state of the law important, right? We can't just change the law the way we think it should be. We might actually have to wrestle with figuring out how the law is. So this is kind of a legal question here. I think that from a legal perspective, the view that the criminal law was never intended to apply to mechanistic humans like ourselves is more plausible than the view that the law was intended to punish in a compatibilist fashion. So if we focus on traditionally recognized sources of law like intent, at least a plausible case can be made that our punishment practices are inconsistent with modern science and require updating. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And here's one kind of example of the law speaking a little bit to these questions, and I think, if anything, it supports this kind of soul-based libertarian view I mentioned. So I'm going to quote from a late 19th century case called Maher v. People. It was decided by the Supreme Court of Michigan. The court said that the circumstances for heat of passion mitigation, so if people in the room aren't familiar with that, the sort of thing where someone kills their lover because they see them in the act of intercourse with somebody else. They kill their lover. It might ordinarily be thought of as an intentional murder, but because they were in the heat of passion after adequate provocation, the law will sometimes mitigate that from murder to manslaughter. So that's what they're talking about. The court said that the circumstances for heat of passion mitigation need not be such a provocation as must, by the laws of the human mind, produce this heated emotional state with the certainty that physical effects follow from physical causes, for then the individual could hardly be held morally accountable at all. In other words, the court there seems to be saying that if an actor's behavior is caused in this physical way, in the way that one physical entity causes another physical effect, the court says that he cannot be held morally or legally accountable at all. So that's some evidence, I'm suggesting, that sounds more like, in this late 19th century court's view, that has this kind of soul-based libertarian view rather than some kind of more modern compatibilist view. Does it matter whether the law is fundamentally compatibilist or fundamentally soul-based libertarian? I think it might. It's true that statutes would superficially look alike either way. They would still refer to terms like intent, but any particular instance of intending will either occur in a kind of mechanistic universe like I think we live in, or a non-mechanistic universe like people probably used to think that we live in. So the meaning of what an intention is plausibly depends on the views of the law's crafters, and they plausibly thought that we lived in a kind of non-mechanistic world. So it's not entirely obvious that from their minds, the kinds of intentions we have now in a mechanistic world would even qualify as the kinds of things that generate responsibility in their minds. All right, so that's pretty bold, and again, I don't think that I have great confidence that that's how we should interpret the law. I don't think there's a lot of evidence, so I think there are a lot of caveats that are worth mentioning. All I say is that this view is plausible. I think that we don't have a lot of careful intellectual history of what all the law's crafters thought over the centuries, so that could certainly alter the plausibility of this interpretation. It's not obvious how to construe their intent, even if we think that we knew what their intent could be. So maybe they just thought, no, our purpose is just to punish people who deserve it, and we have no further intentions about what kinds of creatures people are and what intent is. So maybe we shouldn't even be considering those things when we think about intent. Did they think that libertarian free will, did they think that having a soul was a necessary condition of responsibility, or did they think maybe it was just a sufficient condition of free will? We don't know. The Maher case that I quoted from sort of suggests that libertarian free will was a necessary condition of responsibility, but maybe that wasn't a common sort of view. So it's not obvious how we take intent into consideration, but I think that there's a plausible case to be made that as we're trying to read the tea leaves, that some of those tea leaves might include whatever tidbits we can gather about what we think people intended when they used words like intent in criminal statutes and other kinds of mental state terms. Now you might say, hey, wait a second. If the law views us as these soul-based agents, these soul-based libertarian agents that we're not, then why don't people raise a claim about that? Why don't they argue in court, the statute says you have to have intent, but I want to present to you, court, all this evidence that the kind of intent that I have is not the kind of intent that's being discussed in the statute. Why don't we see cases like that? One answer is I don't know. I don't think it's ever happened. I've never seen such an argument like that, so maybe it could still happen. But I think another answer, maybe a more plausible answer, is that it's just kind of deeply rooted in the law that we are responsible for things. It might even be deeply rooted in the law that we're these kinds of soul-based libertarian agents. And so people aren't challenging these things in court because it's just a kind of fundamental assumption of the system that people haven't challenged, just kind of like stare decisis. You're not necessarily, where's the statute that says, oh, and we should follow the principle of stare decisis? You might not find that statute that says, let's follow that principle. It's just sort of so deeply embedded that we tend not to question it. So that's one answer, is that it's just so fun. One answer is that maybe it'll happen. Another answer is that no, it's not likely to happen because it's so fundamental. Another answer is, well, maybe it could happen, but no one thinks there's a judge who's going to be conducive to such an argument, and I'll talk about that a little bit more soon. So there are a lot of possibilities that why we don't see it. But notice that we do see some arguments that are kind of hard to explain on the compatibilist version and might actually be speaking to some of these soul-based libertarian arguments. So think about the kinds of arguments people give in mitigation in, say, a death penalty case where they're trying to present evidence of abuse when they were a child or something like that to mitigate punishment. They're not saying that the person is irrational now. They're not saying they don't know the difference between right or wrong, but they're somehow saying that this evidence of abuse affected their brain in a certain way that should mitigate punishment. So it has that quality where they're giving a partial causal story for why the crime was committed, and it's meant to reduce the amount of blame that we're likely to ascribe. And I think that has some connections with this kind of soul-based libertarian idea. It's not obvious why that particular explanation is going to reduce punishment when it doesn't fall into a traditionally recognized kind of excuse framework. Okay, so let me actually pause there because I think it's good that even though the real Q&A comes later, I think it's good to not just hear me talk and give you guys a short opportunity to ask a few questions or, yeah.
What do you think about the Weinstein case in New York from 1977 where a guy throws a light out the window and then they do an MRI and they find out there was some tumor on the brain?
Yeah, so I think that
That wasn't, it was only partially litigated, but how would you, that was a potential case early because he pled guilty to manslaughter, but how would you fit that into your paradigm?
Yeah, one thing, I think that case is old enough, it may even have predated MRI. It might have been something like a PET scan or something like that. So, yeah, there are some cases where people try to present brain imaging evidence of some kind of abnormality to justify, not to justify, but to try to mitigate punishment. And I think it's very much like the same sort of thing in death penalty context. It seems to fit the reduced responsibility reaction. That is, just by hearing about the causal explanation, it tends to make us want to blame less. And so I feel like the reduced responsibility reaction, it puts us in an uncomfortable position. It's not a stable position because what if we gave you even more explanation? What if we explained not just why this arachnoid cyst that he might have had contributed, but also why other things contributed, like his impulsiveness, and we could tell you a story about that, or his inability to control his violent temper or something like that. So I suspect that more and more of that information would push us more and more in a particular direction. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Sure, sure.
federal system, they talk about abolitional acts. These are abolitional and then with departure, percent, and abolitional could mean to somebody so out of character, and why is that a character? In some way, you can argue it wasn't voluntary, peer pressure, compelled to do something, it wasn't, it's almost a physics thing, right?
Yeah.
The urgency,
Mm-hmm.
all those things, we take that into consideration.
Okay, super. So let me focus on the first part of what you said about of the Voluntary Act requirement. So yeah, that's true. So we'll see that in lots of places, that there's some requirement that you have a Voluntary Act, and Model Penal Code has it, New York. And so what does that tell us, though, about free will? It doesn't tell me as much as I'd like to know. So it's true that you have to have a voluntary action. You have to have some like willed muscular contraction. It doesn't tell us enough about what we mean by willed to distinguish between the soul-based libertarians and the compatibilists. So the soul-based libertarian view, it's easy to see what we want there. We want, your soul to have initiated the action. But the compatibilist has a response too. They would say, no, what the codes mean when they speak of a voluntary action is, yeah, even though it's billiard balls banging into each other, it still qualifies because, generally speaking, our actions are the result of our rational faculties, and so long as you're acting rationally, we'll count that. So I think that I should be more specific when I say that the law doesn't talk about free will, because I do think that the Voluntary Act requirement is getting to free will, getting to the topic of free will. What I probably should say is that it just doesn't do enough to specify the solution to the problem of free will, like which of these solutions we can make sense of. Yeah, Nina.
What about circumstances that affect not diseases, but psychological circumstances that affect the will? For example, somebody who is accused of murder who has been raised in a family where they were abused all the time. And that certainly comes up in mitigating circumstances under the federal sentencing guidelines. And I think that's a whole other area where what you've endured in your life affects your will.
Yeah, and I think we have to ask the question of, like, why is it that those stories have an effect on us? And what would happen if, and so is it something, I think what happens is when we hear about something like that, our reaction is, well, how can you punish them so severely? It wasn't their fault that they were abused as a child. And of course, that's exactly right. But it's also true that it's not their fault that they have whatever violent dispositions they have, or impulsive reactions that they have, or these kind of odd ways of thinking about the world that aren't so healthy. Those are not their fault either. Now, we don't go around our lives thinking about the world that way. We go about our lives thinking there are some things that aren't our faults and some things that are. But I think when you start putting the microscope to those things and looking at it in terms of brain functionality, and then it becomes harder to tell the story of why some things warrant the reaction and some don't. In other words, there's a certain force that's pulling us to either say, hey, wait, these are all just physical explanations of what we're doing. None of them should count. Or the opposite, wait, these are all physical explanations of our behavior, and there's nothing left that I normally think of as will or control, so it must not be part of what's really going on. So maybe one more, and then I'll keep reading a little bit. Yeah, in the back.
Oh, you know what, if you can talk about Mike.
So when we talk about this tension between the mechanistic view versus the libertarian view, and it seems like people are more willing to accept the mechanistic view when it's something like abuse or a arachnoid cyst or toxoplasmosis, and then you look at the Ethan Couch case where it wasn't abuse, it was the opposite, but that's used in the same way as the excuse that because he was so well treated with affluence and a lack of structure, that was the excuse given for why.
You said the Couch case?
Yeah, the Ethan Couch, the affluenza case
Oh,
in
affluenza,
Texas.
okay.
Yeah. Sorry. The argument is identical to that of here's someone who is abused and so they can't control their violent impulses, except here it's that someone was raised in an environment so devoid of moral structure that they lack, essentially the argument is that they lack the free will to make the proper decision. And isn't the real problem there for society, for the law, that's distasteful, it's indigestible?
Yeah, I think that our sort of lay views, our intuitive views about a lot of cases aren't going to fit together well. I think that there are kinds of pathologies that can develop in situations of extreme deprivation, and there are pathologies that can develop in situations of extreme surplus. And I think you're absolutely right that in terms of our reactions, we feel very differently about those things. We feel bad in one case and not bad in the other. And I think it's hard to untangle that mystery. I mean, there are a lot of things going on. So at least in the affluenza case, you might say, yeah, he probably did have some pathologies from the way he grew up, but he also had certain advantages. So we don't feel like net he gets a lot of mitigation in that context. Whereas in the typical case of extreme deprivation, you might think, well, he had extreme deprivation and he didn't have these other considerations. But I'm very open to the possibility that we're just not fully consistent about these things. That if you tell people, should we mitigate punishment for a prisoner who just grew up in an environment of abuse such that being in a small prison cell creates a traumatic reaction, it creates a claustrophobic reaction, and I think you could tell a story that way that we'd start to say, yeah, maybe we need to take into consideration that the special intensity or this prisoner's special sensitivity to punishment. Whereas you could tell a similar story about a person who grew up with great wealth, you know, like a Paris Hilton who has everything and eats great food and then goes to prison and has that same kind of claustrophobic reaction, that fear reaction that's just as intense as the first person, but now our reaction is not one of sympathy, it's one of, well, you just shouldn't have committed the crime. And so I think there may be some reasons that can distinguish it, but I think a lot of it is that our intuitions don't work in the kind of careful philosophical way that would make these situations consistent. All right, but we'll come back to all of this, so we'll have opportunities for more questions. Let me move on to part 2. So suppose you think, all right, well, maybe that interpretation I gave of the law is correct, maybe it's not, but it's still too removed from the way that most people think about the world. Most people don't think, yeah, nobody's responsible for anything. And I think that's also true of judges. Judges don't think nobody's responsible for anything. And I don't believe that any judge in 2017 is going to get a case that says, well, look, there's no free will, and the judge is going to say, you're right, you go free. I don't think that's going to happen. But interestingly, there are a couple of researchers, Joshua Green and Jonathan Cohen, who make a prediction I think is interesting in this regard. Okay, so they say that advances in neuroscience will lead to a kind of Neuro Law Revolution, and that revolution is going to fundamentally change the way that people think about criminal justice. They predict that as neuroscience vividly demonstrates the mechanistic nature of our behavior, people are going to be less inclined to blame criminals on retributivist grounds that they deserve it, they ought to suffer for the bad thing that they voluntarily did, and rather will blame people on more consequentialist terms, on grounds like deterrence and incapacitation and rehabilitation. Here's the main example, here's one of the main examples they give. They try to say, okay, well imagine a future where neuroscience gets so much better. It's so much better that we now have scanners, and those scanners can look at your brain in real time and try to figure out what's going on. So imagine we have one of these scanners and we put someone in the scanner and we say to them, well, would you like to have the soup today or the salad? And as you ask the question, you ask them if they want the soup, we see they say the blue neurons lighting up in their brain. And then as you ask them about the salad, you see the red neurons lighting up in the brain. This is the way they describe it. And you sort of see the exact causal process of how they're deciding between whether they want the soup and whether they want the salad. You're seeing the things in there, the things that take them from the input, the question, which do you want, and all the factors that mechanistically lead them to say what they say. So they want you to imagine this, and they want you to imagine that this becomes something that's common and easy to do. And they say, what will we think of responsibility in that world with this sort of very vivid illustrations of our mechanistic nature? They say that as more and more scientific facts come in, providing increasingly vivid illustrations of what the human mind is really like, more and more people will develop moral intuitions that are at odds with our current social practices. So interestingly, this is a view that doesn't depend on what you think of the free will question. It doesn't matter whether you think we should be compatibilists or whether we should deny free will. It just depends on a prediction about what human beings are like. So you could hold particular religious views. That doesn't mean that others will come to agree. This is a kind of sociology of belief claim, what they think people are going to be like. And I think it's interesting. It's not clear if they envision a kind of gradual evolution, that neuroscience is gradually improving, and as it's gradually improving, we're gradually starting to become more mechanistic in nature, or maybe it's something that kind of happens more quickly, some kind of epiphany, and we start to see neuroscience in a new light. They don't say that, but that's their view about how things are going to change, and they take the view that this is going to lead to a more consequentialist system. Like I said, a system where we're punishing people not because they are morally blameworthy for something they've done, but rather because we want to get good consequences out of it. We want to reduce harms through deterrence and incapacitation and rehabilitation. Are they right? I don't know. We don't have a ton of evidence for this view right now. I mean, over the last several decades, neuroscience has improved. Demonstrations of the abilities of neuroscience have improved. Have we seen already a shift toward more consequentialist approaches? I'm not sure. I mean, maybe you could find it. You could find some evidence of that. You might also find some evidence the other way, at least in terms of kind of punishment theory and scholars. The typical view is that there's been a kind of renaissance in retributivist thinking, not a renaissance in consequentialist thinking. So it's hard to say. Maybe there could be some tipping point and we just haven't hit it yet, so that when neuroscience gets good enough, things will change. Maybe, or maybe their prediction's wrong. They certainly acknowledge that these retributive kinds of impulses that we've had, these urges to find people blameworthy, are very deep. And they recognize that we're never going to give them up fully. Their view is something like this. If you're kind of living your day-to-day, you don't have to use the best theories all the time. So if you're just kind of living your life, you could kind of be like a Newtonian about physics. You don't have to get the best physics, it just has to be good enough. It's kind of like when you're walking around on our planet, you can sort of treat the Earth as flat, and most of the time you're going to be just fine doing that. But they say, if you work for NASA, hey, wait a second, you've got to use the real science. You've got to use the best Einsteinian relativity. You've got to recognize that the Earth is curved. And so they say, if you're a legislator, someone who's involved in the criminal justice system, you've got to put on your best theory. And they say that our best theory, in their mind, is one that's consequentialist and that denies free will. Okay, so that's interesting. And maybe they're right, but it would be helpful if they told us a little bit more about the mechanism of social change, why they think it's going to change, and what the evidence for it is. And I think they would acknowledge that we're not there yet, that they don't have a whole lot of proof. So we'll see. You might wonder, is it even possible, though, to have this kind of responsibility revolution? And I think the answer to that is maybe. And there's some history to our views about responsibility that might surprise some of you, at least. So this brings me to the topic of animal trials. During the past millennium, there have been many documented cases in which non-human animals, things like pigs and moles and rats, have been put on trial and sentenced for crimes of various sorts. So let me quote from an article by Paul Berman about one of these cases. In 1750 France, a man and a donkey were discovered in an act of copulation. They were both charged with bestiality, but while the man was sentenced to death, the donkey was subsequently acquitted on the ground that she was the victim of violence, and she had not participated in her master's crime of her own free will. There's that word. At the trial, the defense had presented a statement signed by many inhabitants of the community stating that they had known the donkey for 4 years and that, quote, she had always shown herself to be virtuous and well-behaved, both at home and abroad, and had never given occasion of scandal to anyone, and that therefore they were willing to bear witness that she is in word and deed and in all her habits of life a most honest creature. Well, I'm sure, like me, you're glad that that story has a happy ending. No, but it's hard to get our minds into that world. It's hard to imagine a world where people really thought that animals could be responsible in the way that we tend to think of humans are responsible. There's a movie from, I think, 1993 called The Advocate that kind of, obviously it's fiction, but it dramatizes some of these cases, and there were many of these cases, so they're well documented. We can't get into their heads exactly to know for sure that they were thinking of responsibility in the ways that we do, but at least some scholars who talk about it make it sound like they really did, right? It seems sort of incomprehensible to us that we could have such a view, but if we could have a responsibility revolution like that, where we used to think that non-human animals were responsible and now we don't, it's possible we could have a similar kind of responsibility revolution in the ways that we think about human conduct. Okay, so, well, I have a couple more things I want to talk about. So let me press on a little bit and then we'll save Q&A for more like the end. One thing to say is even if we don't have a revolution in responsibility, there are all sorts of new technologies that could have very interesting impacts on the criminal law. Some of these involve things like mind reading. So for example, there are a couple of companies that have sold services that were purported to be fMRI, a form of brain imaging, that was supposed to tell us whether or not somebody was lying. And one of these companies, CFOS, I believe no longer provides the service, but there's a company, No Lie MRI, which I believe still provides the service. And it's something that is very active in the neuroscience community, trying to see how accurate we could get our brain imaging as a kind of lie detector. And at least in some very controlled kinds of situations and college students and things like that, we can get pretty good results. The problem is when we think about the very different ways that people can be, and that some people are on drugs, and that some people are old, and some people are young, and some people have all different sorts of brains, it becomes less confident that we can trust these results when we're applying them to real-life scenarios where something's really on the line. So people are working on that. There was one study where they had something like 100% accuracy, but then when subjects tried to fool the brain scanner, the accuracy went down dramatically. So there are countermeasures you can use to these sorts of systems. But I think one thing that I think is really interesting about these technologies is that even if some sort of mind-reading scanner isn't very good now, I refer to what I call the technological look-back principle. So the idea here is, even if they don't work now, maybe in 30 years from now, they actually will work. And in 30 years from now, someone can say to you, hey, remember that time in September when you went to Brooklyn Law School to get that CLE, and maybe you stopped at a strip club afterward? Did anything inappropriate happen that night? Or you can ask you questions like, well, there was some suspicious behavior you engaged in several decades ago. Did you hide the body in such and such place? In other words, even if there's no good scanner until the future, behavior that you're engaging in now might become much more difficult to cover up. This may sound familiar. It sort of sounds like what might have happened to people committing crimes, in the 1960s and 1970s, who thought, what do I care if my hair appears at the crime scene or my blood? It doesn't matter. No one's going to trace that to me. Well, along comes DNA evidence, and of course, there's a technological look back there. That is, even though good DNA technology doesn't come later, it has this look back quality where we can examine evidence that happened before it. So there's a lot that could be said about technology, but in the last few minutes that I have, let me just make a point about the free will topic, which was the main thing I wanted to talk about. So you might say, all right, Colbert, this is what you've told us. You've told us that there's a deep philosophical problem with hard answers. No one really knows the answer. The law doesn't make clear what its view is about these matters. There's a plausible case, I think, that it could have these kind of soul-based libertarian intuitions, which would mean that it doesn't mesh well with the way the world is now. But I just said plausible, so I wasn't putting a lot of weight on it. I then said that even if whatever you think about free will, as a predictive matter, society might change. Society might change in the ways that Green and Cohen say, based on new sorts of technologies or other things that influence our opinions. But what do I think about the free will debate? What I would say is I don't know. I mean, I have my own inclinations, I have my own intuitions, but if I said I know the solution to it, I'd have to be lying to you because I can't purport to have solved this puzzle that's existed for centuries and centuries. But I think there's one important consideration that sometimes gets overlooked, and that is think about what we need to show in criminal cases when it comes to facts. We need to prove that every element of the offense was committed beyond a reasonable doubt. When we're talking about facts, we need to be very, very confident. Now, as you know, courts and judges are reluctant to put numbers on what beyond a reasonable doubt means. Scholars less so. So, scholars will talk about, 95% confident or 99% confident when trying to get a sense of what this means. But here's what we can say, that's a really high number. And we talked before about the Voluntary Act requirement. Suppose there was a factual question, did the person engage in a voluntary act? So maybe this case where this woman was laughing at the Sessions confirmation hearing might raise a question of whether it was a voluntary act. Well, if we were to convict her of that, we should find beyond a reasonable doubt that it was a voluntary act. Okay. So for that, we need to know it beyond a reasonable doubt. But what about the question of whether there are any truly voluntary acts? What about the question of whether we have free will at all? How confident do we need to be? I have my doubts that any of us can believe beyond a reasonable doubt that we have free will, right? I don't think we should believe with anything like 95 or 99% confidence that we have free will. Now, strictly speaking, the law doesn't require us to. In fact, the law very rarely tells you how confident you need to be in any legal proposition, right? So some interpretations of the statute favor the prosecutor, some favor the defendant. Maybe if it's exactly even, the rule of lenity will lean us one way or the other, but it doesn't generally say this is how confident you need to be in the law. But it's an interesting puzzle. It's interesting to puzzle as to whether the confidence level we need for matters of law should be less than the confidence that we need for matters of fact. You might think that the reason that we want to be very confident when it comes to matter of fact is something like a Blackstone ratio, right? There are certain kinds of errors that are worse than others. It's worse to put a person who shouldn't be in prison than it is to put someone who shouldn't be in prison and allow them to be free. Well, that same sort of consideration arguably applies to things like free will. If we don't have free will, well, putting those people in prison is sort of on par with putting people who are not guilty in prison, at least in some respects, at least from a kind of retributive perspective when you're focusing on whether a person deserves to suffer. So I do think that even if you don't know the answer to free will, we should at least think about this sort of burden of proof issue as to how it ought to apply in the criminal law. And with that, I really open it now to questions, and actually for our 10-minute comment, right?
Well, I don't know if it's going to take 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, what a fascinating talk, and we're going to have some good discussion in a few minutes, so I'm going to be rather brief. One thing that came to mind for me, I saw an interview many years ago with the Yiddish novelist Isaac Bashevis Singer, and the interviewer asked him, "Mr. Singer, do you believe in fate or free will?" And he said, "Show me someone who believes in fate trying to cross 7th Avenue when a bus is coming, and I'll show you someone who believes in free will." Now, psychologists have, over the years, reported something that's used to be called the fundamental attribution error, and more recently is called the correspondence bias. And it's rather neutral with respect to whether there's free will, but I think it opens up a range of possibilities that might be interesting to you, Adam. And that is, we tend to overemphasize the extent to which people act in a way that is consistent with and driven by their character, and we underemphasize the extent to which circumstances drive our behavior. Mm-hmm. One illustration of this, even if you're young enough that you wouldn't remember this, you've probably heard of the Kitty Genovese murder case where this poor woman was seen publicly to have been killed, and nobody turned in the perpetrators, even though there was people watching. That's the story. It turns out didn't quite happen that way, but that doesn't matter for purposes of the experiments I'm going to tell you about. So these two well-known psychologists, John Darley and a guy named Latney, did these studies together, where they got a bunch of people. This is at NYU. So they take a bunch of college students, and they said, we're trying to study how people react to going to college in an urban environment. And they're going to be, some of them they said it's going to be you and one other person talking to each other, you and 3 other people talking to each other, or you and 5 other people talking to each other. But you're all going to sit in your own rooms, and you're going to have a headset on, and when it's your turn to talk, you'll be told that it's your turn to talk, and then then other people can hear you, but nobody can hear you until it's that time. So we don't want people reacting to each other's faces and so on. What they didn't know is that this whole thing was totally phony, because what the subjects didn't know, because what really happened was they had somebody giving the symptoms of a simulated epileptic seizure. So it was either the one other person, or one of the other 3, or one of the other 5, but it was the next person to talk. And they had also instructed them, if anything goes wrong, just run out into the hall and you can talk to the monitor that's taking care of all of this. If you thought that you were one of 5, you didn't go out in the hall. Somebody else will do it. If you thought you were the only one who could go out in the hall, because there's only 2 of you, they ran right out in the hall and rescued the person. So the purpose of the experiment was to show that whether one is likely to report something terrible going on in a way that would seem only responsible for any decent person to do depended more on the circumstances, namely whether you thought there were other people involved, than it did on your character or any desires that you had or your level of morality or commitment to human behavior. Now, you can't really tell whether the reason that people give more credence to somebody's character, because then you ask, what about this guy that didn't go out? Oh, that's terrible, this is awful, he's an awful person. But you can't tell whether the reason we attribute people's behavior to their character is because we think they're acting freely, or because we think that their character is driving them as a mechanistic matter. And circumstances we know we look at as a mechanistic matter. So we know that if there's only one person there, so whatever should be triggered in your brain to act as responsibly as possible is not triggered in your brain. So we now have 3 possibilities. We have we have bumper cars. You didn't use bumper cars. What was the analogy?
Billiard balls?
Billiard balls. Yeah. There's billiard balls that don't have any possible will of their own. Then there are people acting freely on their own accord. But then there are people who are acting consistent with their character, whether they really want to or not. And how they got that character is something that's obviously discussed in all kinds of various ways. So then the question becomes, how much legal or moral responsibility should we all have and attribute to others? If the action is not really intentional in the sense that the lawgivers intend the term to be understood, but on the other hand, it really is about who you are. Should you be held legally and or morally responsible for acting in a way and acting consistent with who you are when better people are acting consistent with who they are without free will, and they're doing better things. And that's really, so I think that's, it's consistent with some of what you were saying, but it's I think how the psychologists are looking at it. That's really the only comment I wanted to make.
Super, yeah, so I agree with all that, and I can just say how I would sort of fold it into my bigger picture in all of this, which is, I gave you a flavor at the end of my talk about some of the problems that I see in the kind of retributive way of thinking about punishment, and so I have this paper called Punishment and Moral Risk that sort of expands on it. And what I say in this, and again, this is focusing on the retributive view. There's other things to say about deterrence and incapacitation and rehabilitation. But from a retributive perspective, the retributivists tend to say, we care a lot about this beyond a reasonable doubt idea, and we give it a high level of confidence that's needed. But then look at all of the factors that are needed to be confident when we're attributing responsibility to someone. So one was that we have free will at all, right? If we don't have free will, it doesn't make sense to say, I'm punishing you because you deserve to suffer for the bad thing you did. How can we make you suffer for the bad thing you did if it's not your fault that you did that bad thing? Then we could add to that other things, such as the entire body of evidence that you were referencing in terms of fundamental attribution errors, things like the Milgram experiments, where we saw people were willing to give what they thought were serious electric shocks to other people that they thought were real people, because there was an experimenter with a white robe who seemed very authoritative, who said, the experiment must continue, the experiment must continue. If we asked people, well, can you believe this terrible thing that so-and-so did? He gave an electric shock that was, marked XXX, and there was a voice of someone yelling from the other side of the room when he delivered it. Can you imagine that assault, that aggravated assault that the person engaged in? And you might think, that's very serious, and most people would never do such a thing, but statistically, it turned out that a very high percentage of people did that sort of thing. So, folding it back into the big picture, why might we doubt our attributions of responsibility that lead to retribution? One is we don't believe in free will. Another one is that we just tend to overemphasize how much responsibility people have for their actions, as opposed to things like character and other situational environments, even if people do have free will. And then, of course, we could add a whole bunch of other things into the mix, like, well, the retributivists say we should deliver proportional punishment. But what does proportional punishment mean? We never get a good answer to that. So if you ask the question, well, how confident are you that you're delivering proportional punishment? I think we're going to kind of have a relatively low level of confidence. How about this? Retributivist, you say that we should make this person suffer because of the bad thing that they do. How confident are you that making someone suffer is an appropriate response to their wrongdoing, right? Some people say 2 wrongs don't make a right. Does a second harm make better a prior wrong? Some scholars call it barbaric to make somebody suffer because they did something wrong, as opposed to other sorts of responses that we have. So all of these things add to the doubts. You have to believe all of them to be a good retributivist. You have to believe that we have free will. You have to believe that we can be appropriately responsible for our actions and they're not just mostly a function of our character and environments. You have to believe that there's some real substance to what proportional punishment means. You have to believe that making people suffer for their wrongdoing is a morally appropriate response. So et cetera, until the end of the day, we're like, well, gee, I'm really sure that he slashed the person's throat, but I have very little confidence as to whether or not that's enough to justify putting the person in prison.
Before we get to I just want one comment in response also, which is this is not limited to criminal law. So for those, I teach contracts, and for those people who litigate contract cases, you try to win a duress defense, it is really hard because people are assumed to have a very high level of responsibility for what they're doing, and the circumstances in which they act are largely ignored by the law.
Do you want to call on people?
Yeah, I'll call on
Okay.
people. Yes. Go ahead.
I have 2 thoughts, but they're relatively basic, so I don't think they'll take much time. The first addresses the remark you said earlier, Professor Solon, about character. And it seems that, as you said, there's the billiard ball approach, there's the character approach, and there's the free will approach. And the character approach seems something somewhat in the middle. It seems that the character approach could be reduced to either or, right? Because character is built up over time by individuals, arguably based on free will, or arguably based on the billiard ball, mechanistic kind of approach.
That's consistent with what I said, with my position on it, yes.
Yes. Yeah, I'm just saying that it could ultimately be reduced to one or the other. So, like, in some sense, on a philosophical level, the question will remain the same in terms of, how you distribute blame or you don't distribute blame, punishment or no punishment. The second thought is, it seems that questions of whether punishment is deserving or not are only really relevant from the sort of the philosophy of people having souls, because nobody really complains about punishing inanimate objects or punishing, specifically atoms, billiard balls. If things are entirely based on mechanics, then what's the problem with quote unquote punishing this entirely mechanistic entity?
Yeah, that's a great question, because so the way I understand the question, it's sort of like, all right, one possibility is that we have free will, and that entails like, we can have responsibility and we maybe have to treat people a certain way. What if we don't have free will? Then the question is, now what stops us from punishing people? Because if I punish you even though you don't have free will, well, you can't blame me, it wasn't my choice, right? Did I fairly summarize the kind of view you're asking about?
Yeah, that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
How can you blame the person who's punishing, but also
Yeah.
who cares about the fact that somebody is being punished and that person is holding set backs?
Okay, great. So one thing to say is that we have to distinguish issues of responsibility from other things that we might care about, for example, like pain and pleasure. So even if we live in a world where nobody's responsible, it doesn't mean that we don't care about anything. In other words, even in a world where we're not responsible, we can still care about having pleasurable experiences, having friends, having loved ones. It doesn't have to stop us from doing that. So for example, a beautiful painting is still a beautiful painting, even if there's no responsibility. An afternoon spent looking at the mountains and the clouds is still a wonderful afternoon, and an afternoon spent in like a smelly prison with scary people around you is still a bad one. So the people like Green and Cohen who say that we shouldn't hold anyone responsible, they don't say, and the rest of the world doesn't matter. They say, no, the rest of the world does matter. In fact, it matters so much that we should try to maximize good consequences relative to bad ones, and we're still worried about the harms of crimes. Like Green and Cohen would say, sure, I don't want to be murdered, I don't want to be the subject of blackmail, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's exactly why they want to punish in a way that tries to minimize crime and minimize the harms of crimes relative to the good things that they want, not having people suffer in prisons unnecessarily.
Christina?
So one way to think about the retributivism problem might be to think about what is retributivism doing if we don't have free will? Right? So if we've sort of evolved to have this sort of retributivist instinct, surely it's doing something. And so the Diodan story from medieval times kind of leads us to thinking it's not about, maybe it's not about the person, even though we say it's about what the person deserves or what fault they have, but it's about us processing what happened or imposing kind of order on a chaotic world or imposing the fact that I believe that good people should have good outcomes and bad people should have bad outcomes. And so I'm doing good, and so I want the person who's not doing as well as me to suffer or something like that. So it could be, it's more than vengeance. I know there's a big, like, oh, it's not revenge, it's retributivism, but I think it's having a more social role, and it's just easier for us to think about it in terms of fault, just kind of cognitively, but that you don't have to necessarily lose retributivism if there's no free will, and there may not really be that much of a problem for the criminal justice system, even if no one's at fault in that really strong way for anything.
So what I'd say to that is we definitely have retributive impulses. There's no question that we do. And you could ask as a kind of scientific question, why is it that we have retributivist impulses? And I don't know the answer to that. I know that some people try to give a kind of evolutionary answer for it. So it could be that we imagine during hundreds and thousands of years of our evolution, there were times when there were people in the community who would violate certain norms, and by shunning those people, banishing them or making them suffer, it had certain good consequences. So those retributive impulses were rewarded in the survivors. So there might be a kind of evolutionary story like that. But I don't think that that evolutionary story has to have a lot of impact. It doesn't have any impact on what we ought to do. It certainly has impact on how we are as people, how we react to things in a kind of descriptive way. But the fact that we evolved that way doesn't tell us that we ought to be that way. So another way that people evolved is to have strong feelings of lust, or to have strong impulses towards sexual domination, right? Those impulses towards sexual domination may have been very fit in the sense that those people who had those impulses passed on their genes and created more people with those impulses, but we don't want to endorse those impulses. So, so does that sort of address your question?
I wasn't making the is ought balance.
Yeah.
I was saying that to the extent that it is helpful for other people to engage in retributive impulses because it is genuinely helpful. We may decide as a society that it is good, or we may decide that it's bad. That explanation can kind of give some meat to what retributivism is really about if free will is just is imaginary, right? What's really going on there? And I think that might be it. And that may or may not be good, but
Yeah.
there's definitely some things that is ought, shouldn't, ought.
Yes, I think you have to start with, like, what's your best theory of what justifies these kinds of things? If you're a retributivist, then they try to give an answer about what justifies having their retributive impulses. If you're a consequentialist, you don't buy that, but you might still say there are nevertheless good features of having these retributivist impulses. So for example, suppose you're like a real sort of like robotic kind of consequentialist and you're maximizing the good and minimizing the bad. Well, that's really hard to do. We're not computers. It could be that our retributivist impulses are pretty good proxies for a lot of consequentialist inclinations. I mean, it's no surprise that lots of times retributivists and consequentialists will reach pretty close kinds of answers. So even if you're not a retributivist and you're a consequentialist, you might find those retributivist impulses helpful. And so just as a consequentialist, you'd have good reasons to promote those impulses to the extent that those impulses themselves promote the net benefits. So I agree.
Yes. Please. Yes.
What about examples of, say, war crimes? I mean, that's certainly a situation where there are plenty of circumstances that could justify somebody acting in a different way than they might normally act, being under orders or extreme duress from the situation of being in a war setting. But is there a different rule, though, when you get to horrific crimes? Maybe we could talk about circumstances when horrific crime, society won't take that into account.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you could say, I mean, you certainly could approach it in the traditional way. You could say, hey, I'm a retributivist, and I think the war criminal should suffer just because of his wrongdoing, and you can say, I'm a consequentialist, and this is what I think. You might also say, you know what, when you're talking about war crimes, the number of people that are potentially affected so dominate any kind of retributivist rationale that what we should really focus on is how do we prevent this from happening again, and what kind of punishment do we need to give this leader that will scare the next leader from engaging in the same kinds of behavior? So you might say, well, I'm a day-to-day retributivist, but when it comes to war crimes, I'm a consequentialist. But anyhow, I don't know. I think it's an interesting kind of punishment theory question as to whether we should think of war criminals the same way as sort of day-to-day criminals.
While this is Adam's show, your question triggered a recollection. During the Iraq War, there was a time when some Americans committed atrocities in a town called Haditha. And my reaction to that was, you can expect that to happen, because these people are under so much pressure. They saw one of their comrades blown up in a mine, by a mine. And so before you start a war, before you go to war, you have to take moral responsibility for the fact that your people are likely to do something like that in advance. Because, I mean, how can everybody be at their best trained, rational, highest selves when they're in an environment like that? Yes.
So, do you mind speaking in
Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
So a couple of things, just in terms of the law and changing the law on the mechanistic view of society. I'll stand up because I can't see both of you. There is an instruction in the New York jury instructions that a person intends the natural consequences of his act. And in fact, there's also a concept both in federal and state law of inferred intent, because one can't see the operation of one's mind. And I think there is an avenue there for changing the law if you want to take the position that we don't intend the natural consequences of our act, but we are worked upon by whatever forces mechanistically to maybe add a jury instruction or start taking issue with the inferred intent concept, which is devastating. I mean, I could even think in the federal system with conspiracy, thought crime. There is all kinds of law where a prosecutor can't prove intent, but they have the inferred intent. In federal, they have conscious avoidance. If you consciously avoid knowing something, then you knew it, and then you intended it. That's one thing. The other thing I want to say is that not everybody in the world is retributive. Mm-hmm. You said we, but in Germany and Finland, they do not have a retributive form of jail. They have, and in fact, it's some prisons in the United States are looking at it. They have what are essentially dormitories. They don't punish. They don't deprive people of food. They allow murderers to get out after 20 years. It's not the same thing, and they are actually trying to incorporate people back into society to prevent recidivism on that. So, and I think we recognize it here, even in just the juveniles now under 18, you cannot get life without parole. That's based purely on the science of the brain and how it develops in adolescence. So.
Thank you.
Yes. No, there were two hands, and I pointed between you.
So I think that the German example is an interesting one in the context where you allow for free will. I think rehabilitation in the context of a deterministic, viewing the mind deterministically, leads you down a very, very scary path, whether it's Clockwork Orange or Rosemary Kennedy being lobotomized because she was a rebellious teenager. I think there's some, it's just interesting to me how a humane impulse under one context inverts and becomes the state choosing its citizens in a way that's absolutely horrifying. More of a thought or a note than anything else.
I suppose that is a risk that we might have to worry about. That, I mean, just being a consequentialist doesn't necessarily justify things that we view as inhumane. But maybe there's something about a certain kind of mindset that leads people in a certain direction that would fit with, Christina Mulligan's concern before about, maybe retributivist impulses or other sorts of impulses might fight against some of those concerns. So yeah, I think it's a complicated question. I think the place to start is, what do we think we really ought to be doing and what do we think justifies punishment, and then you have to look at the next level and say, well, how ought we behave in a way that's going to best accomplish those goals? And there might be ways that people tend to mess these things up.
It becomes necessary in a complex society to organize it. Law is part of that organization, and there's criminal law and tort law and contract law, and they're all basically fundamentally designed to govern the relationship between various aspects of a complex society. And so criminal law is integral to that. And so you can say that the criminal statutes and the whole system is fundamentally embedded in organizing the society. And so it becomes necessary to have a form of criminal law to do that. And so it becomes virtually moot to talk about determinism versus free will. So the society says this behavior, no matter what it's caused, is something that we cannot tolerate, because if we do tolerate it, then the society breaks down. So ultimately, if you say there is no free will and everything is deterministic, it follows, therefore, that there cannot be any criminal law, any criminal sanction, and therefore, in a sense, the society will completely break down because there is no enforcement of normative behavior.
I think I wouldn't go that far. I think that we could still have criminal laws, whether we're retributivist about it because we believe in free will, or you might be consequentialist who doesn't believe in free will, but you still punish simply because you want to deter, you want to incapacitate dangerous people, you want to rehabilitate people. It's true, the criminal law on the books might look very similar regardless of which theory you have, but there'll be instances where the theories will diverge in various ways. So for example, one thing you have to think about when you're crafting a criminal justice system is what sort of prisons you want to have. If you believe that punishment is about making people suffer, then you might want to have prisons that make people suffer. On the other hand, if you think that prison is about mostly about rehabilitation, then you might want to have very different kinds of prisons. So it's not the case that in one case we necessarily have to drop all criminal laws, but I think our justifications for those laws can change, and they'll change somewhere around the details when we're thinking about precisely what crimes do we want to have when we're not sure whether we should criminalize, and precisely how long do we want sentences to be when some offenders have really strong reasons to be deterred, but weak reasons to incapacitate, or weak reasons to deter, but strong reasons to incapacitate, and then the suffering rationales might have various weights too. So I think these different weights will affect the details.
But if you say in an abstract sense, there is free will or there is no free will. And so if you're saying that there is no free will, how can you justify any criminal sanction?
The justification for it would be that it's not about blameworthiness. It's not about saying you ought to suffer for the bad thing you did. The justification would be entirely forward-looking. It would be entirely, we are making you go to prison because we don't want other people to do the same thing as you. Now, not everyone finds that appealing. Some people think that the only justification for putting someone in prison is that they deserve it, that they're blameworthy. But it's not the only justification that people have offered.
Dana?
What about jury nullification? We're talking about where do we find in the law this idea of, a sense of will. And we have historically accepted jury nullification. And maybe that's where we find it, and that's why we accept it. There's been a lot of talk about jury nullification. Is that good or is that bad? And I was just sitting here, I was thinking about that question all along, and then as you were giving this response, I was also thinking maybe if our criminal justice system didn't look at will, but looked at what do we want to do to prevent certain kinds of behavior, and that is what our punishment system is about, then we wouldn't need jury nullification as much, maybe.
So you think that jury nullification is like a kind of
It's
backstop?
yeah, it's a backstop. It's what we have maybe unknowingly put there because of this gray area. So that because there are certain situations, and as a society we want to accept that, where a jury will look at a situation and say, we just really don't want to punish this person, and we
Yeah.
therefore not convict, even though the law says this person should be convicted.
Yeah, there was a case that it was a medical case. It was reported in medical journals, not in legal journals. It was about a man who basically seemed to lead a kind of an ordinary life until at one point he makes a sexual advance at his prepubescent, I think it was stepdaughter, and because of this he has to go through a kind of like a sexaholics type program, and he has to complete it in lieu of if he doesn't want to go into prison. And he ends up going to this program, and he starts, hitting on other people at the program, and so he's going to have to go to prison, spend some time in jail. And what happens is that right before he's supposed to go in, his symptoms get even worse, and now his handwriting starts to get weird and things like that. And what they find out is that he has a tumor, and that tumor was pressing on part of his brain, and they remove the tumor, and afterwards, all these sort of inappropriate sexual behaviors disappear. So that, to me, is a really interesting case, because he doesn't have a kind of obvious legal excuse. It's not insanity in the sense that he may well have understood the difference between right or wrong. It doesn't seem like it's necessarily an irresistible impulse, although it was surely something that made it a very difficult impulse to resist. And I think it would be, so again, this was a medical case. It would have been interesting to see if a jury faced something like this, if it might sort of be a nullification opportunity where jurors might say, well, yeah, we don't have a lot of law to hang our hats on, but it just feels a little bit weird to punish him given the fact that he had this tumor. And of course, it's kind of like a variation on the toxoplasmosis thing that I started with. But I do think it's interesting to wonder if there might have been cases of jury nullification that had something to do with concerns about free will or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, the point that you just touched on has raised an issue that's been bouncing around in my mind, and that is one of mens rea and a guilty mind. And I wanted to ask a comment about that, but I also wanted to say something about what Larry had said. The difference between destiny and free will. I think that was really an important point, because sometimes destiny might be the fact that someone had some pressure leading on his brain and caused him to behave in such a way that relieves him of the mens rea, the guilty mind aspect, and that therefore he's not culpable. But anyway, any event, I kind of throw that thought out there.
I had the same thought you did. I want to turn it back to Adam. What happens if you can't act with the kind of guilty mind that the law incorporates in the mens rea literature, because that's just not who you really are? Does it make any sense for a society to say, we know this isn't really true, but we think society's better off abiding by the fiction that it is true, and doing the same investigation, even though all we're doing is really asking who's acted in a way that simulates a mens rea that really doesn't exist? Can you imagine that being a way for a society to organize itself?
Yeah, I do. So, well, on the first part, I mean, let's say this person with the tumor intentionally touched his stepdaughter, or intentionally tried to touch his stepdaughter. Saying that he has the tumor doesn't obviously get rid of the intentionality behind it. I mean, I think most courts would still think of it as being intentional. So, partly, one observation is that, okay, in this case, it was a tumor that makes us think that he wasn't responsible, but in the other cases of people who engage in these inappropriate touchings, there are something like tumors. They're smaller, they're more dispersed, but they're still physical causes that lead to people doing these things. So that's one comment. And then on the last part, even if we didn't think people were really responsible, ought we still treat them as responsible? I think Green and Cohen would say yes. That's their view. Their view is even if we're not responsible, we should still punish for these other rationales. And I'm inclined to agree with them. Now, notice there's a kind of fine line between being there could be a fine line between being a consequentialist about punishment and being an abolitionist about punishment. Both of them say, both the consequentialists and the abolitionists say, we don't need moral responsibility in order to do what we do to you. The abolitionist says, you're dangerous and we may need to confine you, but it's not supposed to be punitive. It's not supposed to make it worse than the situation that you're in before. The consequentialist isn't necessarily all that different than that. All they say, though, is, yeah, that's pretty much right what the abolitionist is doing, but you know what? We have a limited amount of money, and maybe we have a choice. We can either make our prison cells like the Ritz-Carlton, or we could use that money for other important things too, like building schools and building bridges and things like that. And yeah, it means that the conditions are a little bit worse. It means those conditions will try to deter crime, but the consequentialist is okay with that. So that's one way of understanding the relationship between those two options, being a consequentialist, being an abolitionist.
I think we're going to have to end it now, but there's time. I have a few announcements. The first is that there's going to be a reception upstairs in which you can continue talking with Adam, and I'm sure there'll be some good conversation. Secondly, I've been asked to tell you that if you are here for CLE credit, you must sign out or you will turn into a pillar of salt. So let's thank Adam and see you upstairs.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Larry.